So we do have an extraordinary guest today, the 26th President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt. And if there's anything that really describes the President, it's a quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson: "Do not flow where the path may lead. Go instead where there is no path and leave a trail." And this President has left many, many good trails for the rest of us to follow. He's known as a corporate reformer. He's a statesman. He's an author, a naturalist, a soldier, and an explorer in his life. He founded the New York Museum of Natural History. He supported women's suffrage and desegregation. He's a Nobel Peace Prize recipient. And his conservation work that he did and has been doing is legendary. National parks, national monuments, wildlife sanctuaries. So it is my deep, deep honor to introduce to you President Teddy Roosevelt.
Delighted to be here. And isn't it a bully day? That is right. My name is Theodore Roosevelt. I was the 26th President of the United States. I was the unfortunate president because I came to the presidency through the auspices of an assassin's bullet. My own party, the Republican Party, said, "My God, that cowboy is president. We will never be the same." The Democrat Party, the descendants of Boss Tweed, said, "That renegade is the president. This country will not survive." I'm glad to say the Republicans were right. This country was never to be the same again, but the Democrats were wrong, in my view, as they traditionally were. But I went to work for this country. I was the vice president. The reason why I was the vice president is because the Republicans didn't want me as president. I was governor of New York, and they sent a delegation because they wanted me out of politics. I was making too much of a good thing. I was putting together a reform issue for the Finger Lakes of New York that would put them in a conservation easement and start protecting that vital resource. I was making it difficult for judges to take bribes, and I was upsetting the apple cart for the Republicans and the Democrats. So they had a meeting in a small room, and they said, "What will we do with Theodore?" And they said, "Let's run him for vice president, and we will never hear from him again." Marcus Hanna had the wherewithal to say, "My God, don't you know that he's one step away from the presidency?" And they said, "That will never happen again." Well, in September of 1901, Mr. McKinley was at the Pan American Exposition, and he was shot, mortally wounded, and 12 days later, I became the president. I set immediately to work because there was much to do. I was not ruling as a partisan issue. I was not a Republican. I was not a Democrat. I was a representative of the people. My time in Medora with my cowboy friends taught me that you ride for the brand. The people that elected you are their bosses, no one else. My time in Medora with the cowboys taught me to love the land from the soil up. The cowboys, those knights of the plains that took care of cattle, that managed the fields and the grasslands so they would not be overgrazed. They managed the water holes in the rivers so they would not be polluted. Those people taught me how to love this country like no other. Without my time in Medora, I would not be the man that's standing before you today. For they taught me the lessons of how this country should be managed. I went on to become president, and first thing I did, I contacted an old friend that I'd met in New York named Gifford Pinchot. Gifford reintroduced me to John Muir and John Burroughs, two strong influences on my life. In 1903, I about killed poor John Muir. He brought me out to California to show me the Yosemite Valley, and especially the Owens Valley associated with it, but he had an ulterior motive. He also wanted to show me Mount Shasta, which was not in my purview at the time. He wanted that protected with the rest. As we sat there, we went off on a hike, and 3 days later, we emerged from the wilderness. I was invigorated with the activity we'd had, and poor John Muir, who was 22 years my senior, came back almost dead. But he was invigorated because we managed to put together a plan to expand Yosemite to include Mount Shasta. And out of that not only came the conservation movement that Gifford Pinchot and I had been looking for, but we came out with sponsorships and things that could happen. Now, I've been called the father of the national park system. I deny that. I am not the father. I probably could claim being an uncle. The father of the national park system was Ulysses Simpson Grant. President Grant, in 1872, Congress, at the behest of groups, had put together a proposal called the National Parks Act. And it was specifically to protect 5 areas, Yosemite in a slight value, but it was put together to protect Yellowstone. Unfortunately, they failed to put money with it, they failed to put guards with it, they failed in every manner to protect it except on paper. But the National Parks Ordinance was signed in by Ulysses Simpson Grant in a moment of brilliance. When I took over in 1901, we looked at that ordinance. And I'm not going to say that Congress is not too bright. Yes, I will say that. Congress is not too bright. But within that ordinance, they left unintended consequences. They left open-ended phrases. They left exploitable material that we could put together and come up and put together the 5 new parks that I issued. Crater Lake, unique in all of the world. Devil's Tower, perhaps one of the most precious things we have in Wyoming. And in this state, we had the only human habitation that we could protect in Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde. For 25 years, the owners of the grazing land in the southwest part of this state had protected Mesa Verde from intrusion because they knew it was a vital issue for the history of this nation. In the late 1880s, they invited 4 people from New York City to view the ruins. They asked if they could take home some souvenirs. They picked up some pots and some baskets and some arrowheads. And they took it back to cocktail parties in New York City. By the mid-1990s, it was being overrun with tourists, and they were taking things helter-skelter. And it was being exploited like no other human habitation was exploited. In this state, 9 women's groups came together in one massive movement, led by a group out of Colorado Springs, the Women's Educational Society. And they put together a proposal. They brought it to Philip Stewart, who was the head of the Republican Party in Colorado, and a hunting friend, and also a co-founder of Boone and Crockett, a conservation hunting group, by the way. And they brought it to my attention, and in the first 5, that was number 4, to be protected under the new National Parks Ordinance that had its origin in 1872. Europe had its cathedrals, and it had its bridges, and it had its castles, but we had no human habitation here except the Anasazis. And it was vital that we protect that. Gifford Pinchot came on staff, and we started a new industry, that of forestry. We started a new science of forestry. We started to manage the forest so that we could harvest them without damage. And we put together a plan for national forests so that we could protect not only the forests of this country for future use, because we are building a nation not only for today, but for our fellows later in this country's history, for our future. So we put together the national forest, 1, to protect the forests themselves, but 2, to protect the precious headwaters of our rivers. God gave us 2 things that we can rely on in this country: clean air to breathe and clean water to drink. Beyond that, human struggle is to take human struggle form. You must struggle for your shelter, you must struggle for your food, but you should not struggle for water and air. And the National Forest provided both of that. Gifford Pinchot, one of the most gifted men I have ever met in my life, put together not only that plan, but the plan for the Forestry Service that took another 12 years to come to fruition. We set about changing, but we looked at the registration and the legislation from 1872. It was not complete. So we looked at what we needed to have, and we had friends in Congress. Henry Cabot Lodge I was a noted friend of mine. And we put together a proposal called the Antiquities Act, which allowed the president, with a stroke of his pen and presidential orders, to set aside properties that are unique to this country, both for education and civilization and protecting the headwaters. The Antiquities Act passed, and it allowed me, with a stroke of my pen, to protect the acreages that we hold so dear in national monuments. And if the national monuments were a success, in 5 years they became national parks. In the first year of that edition, we protected 2.6 million acres of land. By the time I was done, it was over 200 million acres of land. Congress sought to thwart me in 1908. They passed an ordinance putting a limit on what I could frank. That's franking, that's signing a letter, on what I could do, and it went into effect October 1st. So Pinchot and I came together, and we had 130 properties that were unique. And on September 29th and 30th, we signed in another 160 million acres of protected forests, protected lands, and grasslands. Congress was not about to thwart the effort that we had begun. This country is a wealthy nation because we have what God has given us in the natural resources we have. It is our duty as human beings on this planet, as the premier hunters and gatherers on this land, to modify it, to make it work for us and generations to come. That is the message that we have always tried to bring forward. It is up to those of us that have wealth, and I came from a wealthy family. We have a special responsibility to take the reins. Unfortunately, in my introduction, Sally made one slight error. My father, who was a tender soul, was the instigator of the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. Single-handedly, he brought that into fruition because he knew that wealth must be spent for the general good of this country. Otherwise, why have it? I learned from that experience, and I learned from my time in Medora with my cowboy friends. I count among my friends the chief scribes and motivators for conservation: John Muir, John Burroughs, Mr. Stansbury, and Gifford Pinchot. I went away from the presidency and I handpicked my successor, Mr. Taft. He promised to keep the progressive ideas that I had, and yes, they were Republican progressive ideas. It was endemic with the Republicans to keep the monetary system going. It was endemic with us that we keep business flowing and to keep the natural resources being used for what they were intended for, the benefit of the people. Unfortunately, Mr. Taft was ill-fitted for the presidency and came under the power of the political parties again. And in 1910, a catastrophe so large that I could no longer deny it. In 1910, in the northwest part of this country, there were 13 forest fires burning in eastern Oregon, Washington, northern Idaho, and western Montana. An unusually dry Pacific wind came off the Bering Sea, fanned those 13 fires into one huge conflagration called the Big Burn. In 3 days, because of neglect by Taft, by stripping the Forestry Service of all their rangers, by stripping them of firefighting equipment, by taking the rangers out of the forest, that forest fire became out of control. In 3 days, it covered 3 million acres, it consumed entire towns, and overtook 3 railroads trying to escape the flames with refugees exploding the engines in their path. It was called the modern-day Pompeii because we forgot that we must take care of what we have. That incident alone caused me to toss my hat in the ring for 1912. And I was running for president again, denying the promise that I had made them that I would only run for 2 terms and I would use Mr. McKinley's second term as my first. For you see, I didn't have a first term and I was owed a second term. I was running ahead in the polls. I had taken all the primary elections newly formed, and I had taken all but one caucus. And as I went to the Republican convention that year, the same people that put me in the vice presidency later on, or years before, stopped me at the door through a parliamentary procedure. They barred me at the door and told me to go away. I was not welcome. They took the delegates that I had that would cause the second ballot for president in that a brokered convention. They took their votes away from them and dismissed them as so much observers. I left and went across the street to another hotel, commandeering all the press to go with me. And I told them it takes more than those people across the street to stop a bull moose. And I was rife for the battle. And we were fighting it until October. I was ahead in the polls. All of the newspapers across the country said Teddy will be president again. Mr. Wilson was running a spirited race and a well-financed one. Mr. Taft was running weakly because he really didn't want to be president. But I was in a speech in Milwaukee, going to the speech, and a gentleman came out of the crowd, extended his hand, and as I went to shake it, he shot me through the worst place a politician could be shot. He shot me through my speech. I had a 50-page speech folded up in my pocket, and he shot me through that, my glasses case, and it came to rest between two ribs. I was bleeding profusely. I stuffed a handkerchief in my chest. We apprehended the miscreant, gave him to the police. And I went on to Congress Hall to give one of the shortest dissertations that I have ever given except for today. They had me there for 3 hours. I gave them 90 minutes of hellfire and brimstone. But they knew what I was about, and this is what this conference is about. We have the benefit of God and Mother Nature on our side. We have places to save. We have places to conserve, but we have places that we must harvest when we can. It is up to each and every one of you. My father gave me an expression that I want to leave you with today. He said to me, do what you can where you are with what you have, and you will succeed. If you do not do something, you will never succeed. But do what you can where you are with what you have, and you will succeed beyond your wildest dreams. And now I pledge you to go out among them, and do not be the critic. Do not be the naysayer. Do not be the coward who tells a brave man how he could have done more. But be the man in the arena whose face is stained with blood and sweat and tears. Take the risk to fail and get up and try again, knowing you might fail. Do that risk, and you will live a long and happy life and be prosperous. That is my challenge to you today. And I thank you very much.
It is so good to have you here. Thank you so much for taking the time to get here.
It was tedious on my body, but it worked well.
I see that. And one of the things that you've just shared with us and is on the minds of most people in this country at 2017, actually a little bit longer than that, is that you were talking about a Republican progressive platform. That is an oxymoron now. And what I wanted to ask you is, the Republican Party has changed so much since your presidency. Where do you think, I mean, if you've had a little bit of time here before you came to speak with us, if you had some time to review what's going on in the Republican Party today, I'd love to hear your response to that question.
Well, not to be too fine a point on it. The political parties in general, the two-party system has changed so far from what our founders had established that we no longer have an adversarial relationship on a respectful basis. What we have is a win at all cost on both sides. That does not allow for governance to the people. Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, and myself followed the same tenor. Government should govern for the benefit of the people. I cannot say it loudly enough. In the West Gate to Yellowstone, above the lintel, it says for the benefit and use of everyone. That is what government is about, to make it about the people of this country and not about party. We have become so insulated in our party identity that we no longer have tolerance, we no longer have middle ground, and if you were asking me which party I would belong to today, I would probably say I would either be independent or a libertarian.
Interesting. Okay, well, thank you very much, because we're really struggling with the ideology of the Republican Party today, and several of the things that you worked so diligently, so hard to achieve. Our Republican president at this moment in time is unraveling some of them, and I have another question about that, but it's very disheartening what's going on in the arena of conservation. You were known as a Trustbuster, and you took on some of the biggest corporations wealthiest men in this country: Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, Carnegie. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, being a Republican, I'm not anti-business. Let me get that out front. But what you have when you have trusts, when you have the big three that are out not for benefit of the people of this country, that are not to make this condition better, even though their myopic view says they are. They are out for personal gain, and they no longer account money as being useful. It is a method of accounting. The big three were out in an anti-American campaign to reduce competition. J.P. Morgan is a prime example of that. He would price his railroads in one state so low to drive other business out of business, and he would buy their rolling stock for pennies on the dollar while raising the prices in another state to compensate for his aggregate wealth. That is anti-competition. That is not Republican. That is not Democrat. That is anti-American. Carnegie was doing the same thing, and Rockefeller was in the competition right with him, and it was perhaps the biggest miscreant of them all, because he avoided prosecution by running away. Now again, Congress had left, the antitrust ordinances that had passed years before was passed out of a feel-good piece of legislation again by Congress, never expecting it to be used. But we picked it up and we made it happen. The law was very clear, and it took us 11 years to bring them to their knees. Carnegie sold out in that time, and because he got religion and started using his money for libraries. But J.P. Morgan and Rockefeller fought us to the end. It is anti-American to drive others out of business when you are in command. You should be prospering others and not suffering this country. And it was anti-American to do that. In my view, in your world today, you have international companies that are performing the same thing. Whenever you see a company buy a competitor to make themselves bigger and better, you are seeing a conglomerate, you are seeing a trust in a different form. You must allow the businesses in this country, no matter what their size, to perform. The antitrust ordinances are just as viable today if they were applied to your international companies. And it should be done.
Yes, it should be done. I would not only say that it is anti-American, it's flat out greed is what they were up to.
It is beyond greed, because Pierpont Morgan used money as chips in a poker game. I have more than you. He didn't even count it as money anymore. The same with Rockefeller. Rockefeller did not count it as wealth. He counted it as who's winning the game. And that's not what business is about. This country is a beacon for people to come here, use their ingenuity, use their minds to make themselves better, to produce a product and to produce life for other people. It is not to come here and gather chips in a poker game and act as if it didn't matter.
Well, now we have something called Citizens United, which is a 501c4 organization, which means that they can take as much money from whoever they want to and don't have to disclose it, to influence elections. And this actually started back in 1988, but it didn't really get going until 2000. There was a lot of pushback because it was financed by very wealthy individuals. And the Supreme Court actually went along with this group called Citizens United. So what we have now, which you didn't have when you were president, yes, there was money. Obviously, you needed money for your campaigns, et cetera. But now it has become absolutely outrageous how much money goes into influence elections. What are your thoughts on this? This is going to unravel democracy.
We have seen in the 20th century the avarice for power. And I go back to why I would neither be a Democrat or a Republican in the current time. because it is winning at all costs. That philosophy. Now, I do not blame the Supreme Court for upholding that particular decision, because if you want to judge corporations as individuals for liability, you must judge corporations as individuals in the political arena. You cannot have it both ways. I say to you that money should be taken out of the political campaign issue. We should not have lobbyists that are in there. I fought lobbyists all of my life. I did not let them in the White House because I had my own method of financing my campaigns. But when you put money in, influence peddling is a natural outgrowth. The other thing that I would say, rather than address the Citizens United particularly, the problem is the politicians that allowed that to fester. And by meaning, I would pity the man that makes politics his entire course of life. A man that makes politics his entire way of earning a living is to be pitied and not trusted. A man must be a successful man in order to run for politics. He must have a family that supports him, and he must have an industry or a job or a position or a practice that he can return to after a suitable period of time of service. This country was founded on the Minutemen process, that Minutemen were responsible to respond to the call of war within a minute with their own weapons. Politicians should have that same motivation, to call for a specific purpose, to go to Washington, to make things better for the people, and then to leave that position for someone else that has a calling. When you have a man that's, the reason why the Washingtonian view of 2 terms for the president is so vital is that you do not want to have a position, a man in the White House for multiple terms that makes it his own fiefdom. If you have professional politicians that rely on money coming in from individuals, corporations, and unions, then you have a politician that has been bought and paid for. Citizens United is a pimple that is festering because of the underlying disease of money in the political system. If you take money out of it, then you have a better system. How you do that in your 21st century, I have no idea.
Well, we might look to England, where there's a cap on how much can be spent. There's a cap both on how much time you can run, so that it doesn't go on and on and on. Now we're into at least 2 years for the presidency, and this will absolutely alarm you. To run for the Senate now, or to run for the House of Representatives, guess how much it costs?
I would have no idea. I believe my entire campaign of 1912 was somewhere around $500,000.
Well, right now, it's $7 million. That's for the House, for a House seat.
The question one should be asked, is why would someone spend $7 million for a $174,000 a year job?
Because they want that ideology to dominate the political platform.
It is ideology, it is party before people. And that was never my intent, and that I do not believe was the intent of the founders.
Yes. I want to ask you about your conservation accomplishments. Of all the areas, you're a great hunter, great sportsman. And of all the areas that you protected, including some wildlife sanctuaries as well, and areas that you visited, which one is your favorite?
That, my dear, is quite a question. Yellowstone, of course, comes to mind because it is so unique from around the world. Sitting on a volcano with geysers and pools and color and animals, and the flora and fauna of that area are unique. I'm proud of expansion. I doubled the size of Yellowstone. I added material to it to protect it. Pelican Island is one that I'm probably the most proud of. I was a birder in my life. I could recognize the calls of 90% of Mr. Audubon's birds, and I could recognize them by their features. When it came to me, the fact in the first 5 when we went to the National Parks Ordinance, that a pound of egret feathers cost more than a pound of gold. It became essential that women's hats should not fly away. And in some cases, they had full wings on them. In a large wind, it would take the woman away with it. But Pelican Island was being overrun because it has such a diverse bird population. I would suggest to you, I'm not going to claim it as being my favorite, but I would suggest to you it was probably the most fortuitous thing that I have done. For it protected more species in one area than any other thing that I did.
Great, thank you, thank you. One of the things that's happening, again, in our time is our Republican president right now signed an executive order to review all of the national monuments over 100,000 acres. And the purpose is because those monuments now are mining, logging is restricted, oil and gas drilling, et cetera, is restricted. So what do you think about that? This is an effort to unravel what you fought so hard for, and our previous president also put a lot of national monuments in place.
The president should not be restricted from franking out properties, as long as they meet the criteria of the ordinance, of the Antiquities Act. A review, if it is just a review, is not outrageous to do. I know not what has been done since my time, but we were very, very secure in the fact that the national monuments that we made were unique in their own right. But I have been called a utilitarian conservationist. One of the things that we have done, and I have spoken to here today, is that we are not only building a country for today, but for our future generations. If we need to have the resources that are available in the protected lands, we must look for a way to extract them with care and with planning and with management. For a review, there is much that we can do, because there was much excesses involved with many of the processes that we went through. But we should never lose sight that we should still protect those areas and keep them inviolate until we absolutely need to have the resources for future generations to use. God has given us a lot, and we must protect a lot. But we must look to that as an eye, because it's to the benefit of the people that we have protected them. If it's a greater benefit to look at them and have them in our stead, in our catalog, then that is fine. If it is better that some of the minerals be extracted carefully, then we must look at that too. But we should not look at it helter-skelter and just go and sell land willy-nilly. There are places that are so unique in this country that we cannot possibly do that.
Well, a lot of citizens are getting involved in this action, because we don't want to see our national parks dismantled, our public lands sold to private interests or states, or these national monuments, which are each one is unique in their own way, for those protection to be unraveled. So I'll report to you when I time travel, okay?
When I time travel.
I'll let you know what happened.
As closing, as with everything, the
Yeah.
whole country needs to get involved with what is happening. It cannot be a small group. Again, I challenge you as individuals. Do what you can with what you have where you are. That will influence and change the course of this country. Nothing else will do. Your generosity and your thoughts and what you are doing will influence people beyond what you think, beyond what I might think. In my time, I did not have to fight the battles you fight. I fought my own. But in your time, you have to do what you can where you are with what you have.
If you had an opportunity to have a one-on-one conversation with President Donald Trump, what would you tell him?
I would tell him two things. As president, you must be very, very careful in doing what you're doing, because you must lead for the benefit of the people of this country. I had the benefit of a bully pulpit, the effect of the newspapers on the citizenry. I milked that to the nth degree because it was my way of getting it out. And the bear story, the teddy bear story that I will tell you after this is over, the simple cartoon that came out spoke more to what I wanted this country to hear than 1,000 words of speech. And by the time my presidency went through, every day of the week there was a teddy bear cartoon about me, about what I thought, about what was going on, and it conveyed the message from a bully pulpit because the news media was there to give the information out. Donald Trump has a bully pulpit in what you call a tweet. But what he needs to do is control that and use it as a message center for what needs to have happen. If he doesn't do that, he is injuring himself and injuring the country. But a judicial use of that bully pulpit that he has more power to it than you can imagine, because it is reaching millions and millions of people every time he does. The bully pulpit is there to be used for the good of the country and the people that reside in it, and not for the politician that uses it.
Thank you very much, President Theodore Roosevelt.